Welcome back to Indigenous Narratives. In episode 2, I talked about who the Jumanos were. The traders, the diplomats, the travelers, the people who connected half a continent. Today, in episode 4, I'm going even deeper. This episode is about how the Jumanos survived colonization, where they went, how they adapted, and what parts of them are still alive today, including in people like me. So, when we talk about Indigenous history, people often imagine it as something frozen in time. Like tribes were these fixed, rigid groups that never changed until colonizers arrived. But Indigenous nations were never frozen. We adapted, we moved, we shifted, we learned. We survived through flexibility, not rigidity. And the Jumanos are one of the best examples of that truth. The world was changing and fast. By the time the Spanish arrived in the late 1500s and early 1600s, the Jumanos were already dealing with major changes. Trade routes were shifting, alliances between tribes were evolving, buffalo herds were migrating, climate cycles were unpredictable. So when colonizers entered the picture, the Jumanos weren't starting from zero. They were entering a world that was already transforming. But what the Spanish brought next changed everything more violently than anything the region had ever seen before. Disease, missions, slavery, forced religious conversion, settler expansion, competition for resources, and intertribal conflicts fueled by European alliances. These changes came all at once, like a tidal wave, and the Jumanos responded the way indigenous nations have always responded, through adaptation. When historians say the Jumanos disappeared, they didn't. In episode 2, I said something really important. Indigenous nations don't disappear. That's a colonial myth, a convenient way to justify land theft and erasure. What really happened to the Jumanos was this. They merged, they intermarried, they migrated, they joined neighboring nations through family ties, they moved into the missions, they became part of Apache bands, they entered Pueblo communities, they lived as Coahuiltecan peoples in South Texas, some became part of Wichita, Tawahash, and Caddoan societies. And colonizers called this disappearance, but really it was survival. Migration is survival. Adoption into another tribe is survival. Taking on new names is survival. Holding on to story even when everything else is stripped away, that is survival. Jumano identity didn't vanish, it transformed. So let's talk about the shift toward Jumano Apache. That is something very important. Why do some sources call them Jumanos, some call them Apache, and some call them Jumano Apache? It's because by the 1600s and 1700s, many Jumano bands had deep alliances with Apache groups, especially the Inde, the Lipan Apache, and the Mescalero. These weren't political alliances in the European sense. They were marriages, shared hunting grounds, protection agreements, ceremony, family. A Jumano child might grow up speaking Apache. An Apache child might grow up in a Jumano trading community. And families moved between both worlds. So over time, Spanish records started grouping them together. Not because the Jumanos stopped being Jumano, but because colonizers couldn't understand a world where identity could be layered and fluid. A world where someone could be both. And then the mission era forced transformation. So when the Spanish created missions across Texas and northern Mexico, they used them to pull indigenous people off the land and into controlled settlements. This wasn't a charity, it was colonial strategy, breaking trade networks and breaking alliances, breaking languages and replacing culture with Catholicism, making people dependent on the mission for survival. Many Jumanos ended up in South Texas missions like San Juan, Espada, Concepcion, San Jose, La Bahia, and Refugio. Spanish records list dozens of surnames that trace back to these mission communities. Names like Acosta, Carrasco, Peña, Aguilar, Luján, Ortiz, Cisneros, Guerrero, Muñoz. These were often Jumano families, and families forced into a new world, a new system, and a new identity, not by choice, but by survival. And even then, they resisted quietly. They kept culture in pieces. A word here, a story there, a plant remedy, a food, a gesture, maybe a taboo or a prayer said in 2 languages. People underestimate how much can survive when a community refuses to let go. And the trade network didn't end. It simply went underground. Just because the Spanish tried to shut down Jumano trade routes doesn't mean they succeeded. Trade went underground and families carried salt and hides in secret, and people traveled at night. Information moved quietly between bands. Apaches and Pueblos and South Texas tribes still reached out to each other when they needed help. To a colonizer, it looked like trade was gone. But to indigenous people, it was simply quieter. And that's what survival looks like. So where are the Jumanos today? The answer is everywhere and nowhere, meaning there isn't one federally recognized Jumano nation today. But the descendants exist, and they know who they are. And they're found in Texas, New Mexico, Chihuahua, Coahuila, Arizona, California, Tamaulipas, northern Mexico, and just scattered all across the Southwest. And in the surnames carried by families who trace their origins back to the missions. The Jumanos exist in the oral histories passed down in pockets of South Texas and northern Mexico. They exist in the families labeled as Apache by colonizers, but who still remember Jumano identity. They exist in people like me, people who grew up disconnected from the history our ancestors weren't allowed to speak openly. People who are reclaiming that story right now in real time. So that brings me to the next subject. Let's talk about the legacy of the Jumanos. So, what did the Jumanos leave behind? More than the history books admit. They left behind a legacy of adaptability and diplomacy and trade knowledge, multilingual skill and movement, border crossing identity and connection to land and water routes, family ties with multiple nations, and survival through transformation. Their identity was never singular. It was never meant to fit into a neat colonial box. The Jumanos are a reminder that indigenous identity is layered, and it's complex, and it's fluid and resilient. And if you carry that story in your blood, you carry that resilience too. The Jumanos didn't disappear. They just became harder for outsiders to see. But we are still here. and still speaking their name and still reclaiming the pieces that were scattered. So, thank you for listening and honoring this history with me today. This story doesn't end with the Jumanos, with who the Jumanos were. It lives in the lands that they moved across, protected, traded through, and carried in memory. And episode 4 explores the homelands and trade routes, alliances, and the deep geographic knowledge that shaped Jumano-Apache identity then and now. This is episode 4 of Indigenous Narratives. Thank you for joining, and I hope to see you in the next episode.